Though it's a warm day, your skin pricks with coolness, as if you are standing beneath a giant air conditioner in the theater of nature. You've been walking this path at the foot of Pikes Peak since... could it really be since 2009? In one sense, you feel you've come so far. But in another sense, you feel you've been spinning your wheels up until now. Turning toward the Anselm Society digital pub, you vaguely wonder if you should have waited for any hidden Easter eggs first. Inside the pub are riotous conversations about arts and faith, and also a great deal of talk about trolley problems for some reason. In a corner table are two men. One of them is giving an impassioned analysis of whether a raccoon could really fire a machine gun. That's me, your host, Matt Millema, and welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society. The Anselm Society, for those of you who don't know, is a coalition of churches all across the Front Range of Colorado dedicated to one very simple, very straightforward mission, Renaissance of the Christian imagination. So we have lots of programs, lots of conferences, content, and you can check that out over at anselmsociety.org. One of the best things we do is an annual conference called Imagination Redeemed. And our topic this year involved a whole number of different topics related to the reintegration of arts into the church. And our guest today, Junius Johnson, was one of the keynote speakers. So welcome to the pub table, Junius.
Thank you.
Now, Junius, one of the things that drives me the craziest is when somebody remembers me from some reason, but there's no possible way I could remember them. So I'll tell a story to put you in this situation. So back when I was in law school, you were at the same place I was getting my law school degree, getting your PhD, I believe. And there was a program at the school called Rivendell that had an emphasis on Christian scholarship, Christian community. It was a really great program. I attended a little bit, but I was swamped with all my boring law school stuff. And you gave a talk there, so I remember you, but I was just a student there, so there's no way you remember me. So don't you just love this asymmetry? So Junius, it's good for me to see you again.
Well, I guess it's good to be seen again.
So like I said, Junius was one of the keynote speakers at our conference, gave a really interesting talk, so I wanted to sort of keep going in that similar vein. But before we do that, Junius, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm a theologian scholar by trade, assistant professor of historical theology at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. My research centers around retrieving resources for contemporary theological reflection from the Christian tradition, particularly from the Middle Ages. And a lot of my work is interested in the ways in which some of the Christian thought of the past can help to illuminate the way that we think about our culture today, to help us to understand the situations we find ourselves in. In a sense, my career is sort of centered around C.S. Lewis's advice and on reading old books, in which he warns that when we read our own books from our own culture, there are blind spots that we're not aware of and that we don't know how to identify. And every culture's got those. And so what we ought to be doing is reading more old books, because though they have their own blind spots, they will help us. They're different than ours, and they'll help us to understand what we're not seeing well about ourselves.
Great. And I will say, on the reading of old books I think it's one of my favorite things that C.S. Lewis ever wrote. I believe it was originally a preface to Athanasius' Incarnation on the Word of God. You'd know the title better than me, but it's free online, so if you all want to check it out, you definitely should. So how did you get into, especially the Middle Ages? Was there one particular thinker who grabbed your attention? How did that happen?
Honestly, I think it probably goes back to watching Robin Hood movies as a kid. I just always thought the Middle Ages were really cool. So I think I was constantly looking for any excuse I could to spend more time there. But when I began my graduate studies, I found myself torn between three disciplines. I knew theology was a place where I wanted to make my home, but I was also very interested in philosophy and literature, and I didn't really want to leave any of those things behind. Literature was my undergrad, and I did a lot of philosophical work in undergraduate as well. And then I happened upon this wonderful discovery that the Middle Ages had not yet invented this wonderful separation of the disciplines upon which we put so much emphasis. And I thought, hey, if I'm a medievalist, then I kind of have to do theology and philosophy and literature, and they can't stop me. So that was very attractive to me as well. But then, in the midst of all of that, I encountered St. Bonaventure, and he sort of sealed the deal for me. This was a man who, contemporary with Thomas Aquinas, had that same rigorous philosophical university education, but also just had a very poetic soul and would speak in ways that oftentimes were very reminiscent of, or rather anticipatory of, Lewis himself. And for me, in him, I saw all of my different loves and interests coming together.
Great. I feel like the Middle Ages are one of those things, especially if you're, one of the people with more bookish intellectual bent, you either love it or you don't get it. I love the Middle Ages. I didn't have the internal fortitude to be a real medievalist, but I really, really love to meet one. So thank you so much. It's good to find another medievalist enthusiast. So how does that incorporate into what you do at Baylor then?
My primary role here is to be an expert in medieval theology. That's kind of what they hired me for. Mm-hmm. I'm teaching in the Great Text program, and our program is focused on the theological, philosophical, and literary heritage of the Western tradition. And within that constellation of text, we do as a department have a belief that theology holds a special place. And so we do hold to the old belief that theology is the queen of the sciences. So all of our courses are seminar courses, and they're interdisciplinary. And we're having the students read text from these various different sorts of ways. But as they're reading a literary text, they're asking theological questions of that text. And as they're reading a theological text, they're paying attention to the literary elements of it and whatnot. And so it actually suits me incredibly well. I get to do all the things that I love so much and bring them all together in all the classes that I teach.
Great. And I feel like if I were to guess, one of the reasons why your talk for the rest of the conference was along those same lines too. So I'll sort of tee up the topic then. So you talked about different ethical, moral issues, how to wrestle with those, but you did that through the lens of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, our conference was this past spring, so that was before Endgame came up and took all the world's money. But now that Endgame is out, and I feel like there's been a safe amount of time that's passed, so all you listeners know we're probably going to get into spoilers, so if you don't like that, go see the movie. It's probably in the dollar theaters now, so just do it. So let's sort of tee that up where I want to first establish your entry into the Marvel Universe. When you were a kid, really into Robin Hood, were superheroes involved there? Or did you come across superheroes later?
Yeah, I mean, I was growing up in the 80s, and we had some classic superhero films back then, the original Batman movies in the early 90s, which I absolutely loved, and we were still the Superman movies were still happening. We had X-Men as a cartoon on Saturday mornings.
That was a classic, by the way.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, we did have those things bumping around, and absolutely, I mean, like any good American boy, I loved the idea that, I could be a superhero and I could do all these things and help people. And even, of course, in its own way, Star Wars, right? Jedi are just space superheroes. So those things were all there. Now, interestingly, I was never much of a reader of the comics. I had a couple of friends who were, and I did pick up a couple of issues of Spider-Man early on. But I never really got deep into that culture. And part of that was a financial question. You had to have startup funds to get these things. And part of it was I knew that, when you get a comic book, you've got to read it with gloves on and you've got to keep it in special protective covering and whatnot so that it keeps its value. And that was just a lot of work. I could just turn on the TV and watch something.
Oh, I agree. So I was actually in a similar place when I was a kid. So I watched the TV shows. So I especially watched the Spider-Man TV show, and my favorite was Batman the Animated Series, where the sky's always red and everything's all brooding. Oh, I love that. But I never got into the comics either, and this is going to sound weird. The comic book store guys really intimidated me, so I didn't feel like I knew enough to get started. But I
think anyone who's ever been to a comic book store knows exactly what you're talking about.
Oh, good. It's a relatable experience. So
it really is.
I feel like this is an intense psychological question I'm asking you. When you were a kid, who was your favorite superhero and why?
I have to say it was Batman. And I think the reasons were a couple. One was he just got to wail on guys all the time, and that was attractive to me. He had the coolest stuff, right? All the great gadgets.
Very true.
But I think a lot of it was as much circumstantial as anything else. Those first two Batman movies with Michael Keaton, especially the first one, were just so unlike anything we'd seen before, and they really visually quite stunning, really captured the imagination, and I was just caught up in that world right away. I remember I very much wanted to go and see the Batman movie, and my older brother, was going to see it with his girlfriend on a date, and I begged and begged to be taken along to this movie, and you can imagine that my brother was not receptive to my pleas. So my parents pulled me aside and gently explained to me that it was not appropriate for me to go on my brother's date. And I said, but Mom and Dad, it's Batman. So I did not get to go, and I was very upset. And then, the week later, my dad picked me up from school by surprise at the end of the day, and we started driving somewhere. I said, "Where are we going?" He wouldn't tell me, and I thought, "We're gonna go see Batman." And sure enough, we pulled into the theater, and I got to see Batman. It was just incredible.
There we go. For a while, I was hoping you would say that you snuck along on your brother's date without your brother knowing and like saw one row behind him. But that's a good ending to the story too.
My brother's a very dangerous man. That would not have been safe for me.
Never want to mess with a teenage boy on a date. That's a dangerous proposition in general. So I will say for me, if I'm being honest, the one I spent the most time thinking and sort of along with was definitely Batman, again, because of that series and everything. But I always had a soft spot for Aquaman, and I'll tell you why. I always felt like Aquaman took way too much guff from people making fun of how his powers were stupid and he was useless. So he was always my dude. I was kind of happy to see a really cool guy like Jason Momoa get cast as the Aquaman. I never saw the movie because it looked weird. But that's sort of been I've been a supporter from afar. So now that we've got the important issues done, let's talk about some of the issues from the Marvel Universe. So I can definitely see where this is all coming together for you, where you've got, on the one hand, your day job is taking these old ideas in Christendom and sort of applying them to the modern context. So that seems to be what you did with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So what about the Marvel Cinematic Universe worked so well with you applying these older ideas to?
Well, one thing is just the saturation of it. The sheer amount of money these movies have made is unprecedented in terms of for a franchise. And it's one of these things that seems like everybody's seen at least one of these movies.
Yeah.
And by the numbers, as many people as go-to movies seems to have seen Endgame, right? So there's just an obvious cultural touchstone there where it's a common experience that we all have. And there's something special, as we all know, those of us especially who've lived in fan culture, whether that be Star Wars or Star Trek or whatever else, know that there's a special feeling that goes along with being in those things in the moment when you're watching them as they're coming out and you're rushing to see them with that opening day audience and counting down the days until the next thing starts. That also strengthens the connection that's made over these. Yeah. So on one level, it's just the going thing, and so it's fruitful to talk about it. But at another level, and I think this is more to your question, there is something inherent about it as well. It's the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I think, offers us a vehicle for discussing some of these questions in a way the DC Extended Universe so far has not. And frankly, in a way that the ongoing Star Wars franchise has not. And what is that? What grounds that? Well, I think it's to do with the fact that the stories that Marvel has been telling, the particular versions of their stories they focused on for the cinematic universe, are driven by characters. They're very close to the individuals who are exceptional, but who are nevertheless still one of us and have to ask the same sorts of questions and deal with the same sorts of challenges that we do, although blown up to a much larger scale. So when they come up against those larger ethical questions about, is it right to kill the bad guy before he becomes the bad guy? Is it right to kill the bad guy at all? How do you resolve these types of things? They're not asking them from an abstract situation, well, heroes can't be heroes and do this. And so obviously it's not. Rather, it's what does Tony Stark at this moment in his journey think about that? How has everything that we've seen of him up to this point lead him to this decision? And then what will this decision do to him going forward from this point? And that, to me, is a really important thing and one of the reasons why it's so momentous and significant that there have been 22 of these movies, because in order to really track those kinds of character-driven conundrums, you have to have time with the characters. Yeah. And we've had time on screen with these characters of a level that has previously been unknown outside of television shows.
No, absolutely. And I'll sort of touching on one of your earlier points there about the cultural touchstone. I was just amazed because, in our cultural moment right now where the entertainment choices are fragmented, and a lot of that is really good. I mean, with Netflix, Hulu, all the different streaming services, I can watch one of hundreds of shows that are basically tailored exactly to me, which means a lot of these shows are better than what they would have been 20 or 30 years ago when there were 5 channels and everybody watched the same 5 channels. But something we lose there is the cultural moment where we sort of have this assumption, oh, you saw this movie, right? And really, these Marvel movies are the only ones that fit the bill now. After Endgame came out, there was just an assumption from everyone I met, whether it's, a peer, somebody like a teenager, my parents, like, oh, you saw Endgame, right? Well, you need to see it so we can talk about it. And that was just a really interesting thing. So I guess before we dive too much into the Marvel, you said something very tantalizing about the DC universe. I don't want to focus on the DC universe because as of now, maybe they'll get their act together. They've had a few good movies, but it hasn't succeeded the way Marvel has. What is it about the DC that falls short of what Marvel's been able to do so far?
I think DC made a couple of mistakes. I think the first mistake seems to have been trying to do what Marvel was doing without looking like they were trying to do what Marvel was doing, right? So, yes, we want to do a series of movies that are connected. We want to have standalone movies for our individual characters. We want to have team-up movies. That's the Marvel formula. But instead of building each of the characters individually, we're going to jump right in. We're going to give you Batman versus Superman and then immediately turn to Justice League after that. And I thought, well, that's the only reason the first Avengers worked was because we had 5 standalone movies leading up to it that really sort of got us invested in those characters and gave us a sense of who they were and why we should care and what brought them to the table. So I think that was a mistake, just trying to go too fast and get caught up too quickly. But that's a mistake that can be forgiven and that you can overcome. The bigger problem was I think they just missed the tone. Batman versus Superman was, to my way of thinking, just an awful movie. It was not fun. I did not like that the Batman portrayed in that movie at all. I had no sympathy for him. I had really enjoyed Man of Steel, and they made me dislike that Superman as well. It was dark and brooding and slow, and the characters' actions didn't make sense. Batman reasoned like a Sith Lord. So there was a lot of ill will coming out of that movie. And Justice League was, in many ways, righted the ship. But note what they did, right? But for tragic reasons, Zack Snyder had to step aside. And I really do think that a lot of the missteps artistically are to be laid at Zack Snyder's door. And so Joss Whedon comes in to finish the film, and he Whedons it up, which is generally a good thing. But in the end, it turns Justice League into a clone of the first Avengers. Yeah. Even down to the plot beats circling around, here's a character who's just an ordinary person who's caught up in all this, and we're going to see them early in the movie, and then we're going to see them throughout the movie in danger and see how the Avengers, the Justice League save them at the end. DC is needed to distance themselves from Marvel because they can't do what Marvel does as well as Marvel does it. They're not set up for it. Their world isn't set up for it the same way. And that's what we saw in Wonder Woman, and that's what we started to see in Aquaman, is they're finding another path that's more authentically DC that allows them to tell their stories in their way without just cloning what Marvel's doing.
No, I think that's right. I definitely agree with the tone aspects. And I don't mean this to sound like I'm being flippant or reductive, but when I go to Marvel movies, I generally have fun and enjoy myself. Whereas when I see a DC movie, it's like brooding, angst.
Yes.
We're going to ask these dark intellectual questions in an uninteresting way. Okay, I kind of want to see Superman punch some bad guys, but all right. So let's go transition now to the talk you gave at Anselm. And I'll just sort of tell you one of the big things that stuck out to me about that really made me think was you talked about how, I believe you're using language like moral imagination, how in a lot of these situations, our moral imagination is shaped by the choices that are presented to superheroes. And a lot of times they're presented, for the sake of the film, as binaries. It's like it's either 1 or 0. And how this can sometimes train us into thinking in an unhealthily binary way. So that was sort of one of my takeaways from it, but I'd like to hear your take on it first.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, essentially my concern is that as we're faced with what happens when we watch movies is we're imagining for ourselves possibilities. Not that we think we're ever going to be in the situation depicted in the film. I'm not expecting to be a government agent whose family is being held captive by terrorists, and I've got the nuclear codes, and I've got to decide hand them over and save my family or not. But nevertheless, I do tend to reimagine my life along these ways, right? I mean, in order to tell our stories to ourselves in such a way that we can be the hero of them, we tend to expand the epic aspects of our life or place an epic character on non-epic things, depending on what our lives are like. And so when I come to those crisis moments where I feel like everything is on the line, a lot of the places where I reach for resources for thinking about how to reason through those moral crises are the entertainment that I have consumed, movies, television, literature, that sort of thing. And so my concern about the way a lot of movies are being made these days is that there is a certain philosophy as to what a good person does, and it's pretty straightforward, right? If your people are in danger, you are justified in doing whatever it takes to save your people, even if it puts other people in danger. And the reason that's going to be okay is because if you do the right thing, that is to say, protect your family, say, you'll still find a way to stop the bad guys. It'll be fine in the end. And so this belief is, well, I've got to protect my family, and if that leads to evil for others, I still have to protect my family first. But also, probably I can do both. And this is the false choice, because in real life, often you can't do both. You can't get away with doing things. To save your family may mean destroying many other families, right? And my concern here is that we're not paying enough attention to the ways that our ability to imagine what's possible are being shaped by these types of stories. When you hear the same story over and over again in a variety of different settings, you come to what I think is the false belief that all stories are basically the same. And when that happens, several things are going to go wrong for us as a society. One, we're not going to start telling as many interesting stories because our imagination for coming up with new stories is going to be stunted. We're going to think, well, all stories are variations on Batman, and so we're just telling Batman over and over again. But the other thing that will happen, I think, is that we'll fail to find those creative, out-of-the-box solutions that have historically been the types of solutions that move societies forward. The great challenges we face in the world, both as a culture, as a nation, and as individuals, require a robust imagination to meet them because the ways we've thought about things to this point have not worked. They've led us to the path that we're in now. So what I was focusing on in that talk was really trying to make appear to those who are present exactly this thing, that there's a kind of training of our imagination that's going on and that we're insufficiently aware of it and that we need to be taking control of how we're training our imagination.
Yeah, and as you're just talking right now, I'm thinking back to my own life, and I can definitely see where that comes in. I'm thinking back when I was an awkward teenager, and, I had like the stereotypical crush on the girl, and I would look at all of the entertainment around me. It's like, well, obviously I'm the protagonist in this love story, so all right, it's going to work out somehow through some, amazing, proof of love scene at the end. And that is often not the case. The hero's journey is a very compelling sort of template. You can see where it is in pretty much every single Marvel movie, but that does sort of put us all in one sort of weird pathway. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the sort of false binary. And let me try to give a little background, because when I was growing up in the 90s, as in an evangelical home, we were all taught that the problem in the culture today is moral relativism, and that to combat that, we needed to learn to tell culture that some things are right, some things are wrong, absolute truth. But it seems, and you would be able to speak to this better, that culture has shifted since then, where if you look at all of the folks, whether on the left or the right, they seem to believe lots of things are absolutely right or wrong, but maybe the difference is that they now are unable to see nuance. So, bringing this back to you, is moral relativism still the problem, or has culture shifted? Has all the stuff I've learned as a boy just become obsolete?
Yes and no, right? I mean, I was really concerned growing up and even through college and the beginnings of grad school that I would have to make arguments to convince my non-Christian interlocutors that there's such a thing as right or wrong. That they fundamentally didn't believe there's right or wrong. There's at best right for you and wrong for you. And I really think that in the last decade or so in this country, we've seen that that's just not the way most people think. I don't know if it was ever the way most people thought. I think it was always just the way the loud people thought. But at any rate, at this point in time, it's pretty clear to me that people just aren't thinking that way anymore. It doesn't take any time at all on my Facebook feed, which is filled with a variety of extreme left and extreme right visuals from various stages of my life, to see that yes, the fundamentalists still believe in absolute right or wrong, as they always have. But now the equally fundamentalist liberals also believe in extreme right and wrong, and that's the rhetoric these days, right? The Trump administration's stance towards X, immigration, abortion, whatever, is immoral because it's chipping away at civil liberties, because it doesn't respect the dignity of human persons, whatnot. I think that's right, and that's good, and actually that creates certain types of opportunities that maybe weren't there when the rhetoric was, no, you can't talk about right and wrong, you can only talk about what's useful or what's beneficial to society or whatever. On the other hand, there's still a lack of a moral compass. And so everyone believes, it seems to me, in right or wrong, but there are a variety of moral compasses out there that are spinning a variety of different directions. And so it's hard for anyone to fix a basis for which they claim something to be right or wrong. So you would think, on the basis of the language that goes behind the gender equality, gender identity equality, sexuality equality. These are all talking about human persons and the rights that human persons have and how no one should be interfering with a person's right to pursue life, liberty, and other such things, right? Mm-hmm. You would think that all would apply directly to unborn human persons. Mm-hmm. But in this case, you'd be wrong, right? There's a different rhetoric that applies to that. And a lot of folks for the pro-life camp, both Christian and non, have been pointing to what they see as a hypocrisy in the pro-choice camp. Whereas the pro-choice camp is likewise pointing to a hypocrisy where they would say, well, you would think that this belief that an unborn human person is valuable would translate into exceptional care for the vulnerable born human persons. And yet they allege we don't see that sort of transference, right? All of this is because we're drawing upon certain things to make these arguments, but we don't really have, as a society, any real absolute way to ground these claims. And so it resembles moral relativism in this way. There's the individual perspective on what's right or wrong, which is true also in moral relativism. But now that's being projected outward as an absolute societal norm that everyone else ought to adopt.
Okay, so it seems like...
Where this binary thinking comes in then is binary thinking is what makes it difficult to find middle ground.
Yeah.
You have to be extreme right or extreme left. It's white or it's black, and that's it. And the pushback is not things aren't just white and black, everything's gray, and you guys are making ridiculous claims. No, there is such a thing as white and black, but the world is in color. Mm-hmm. And so there's more going on than just white and black or shades of white and black. Mm-hmm. There's more going on in any given particular moral quandary than is this right or wrong to do, because there's also the question of is it right for you to do? For example, right, Paul would say that I think James would say if anyone knows the right and doesn't do it, for him, it's wrong.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think you're right to point to a lot of what is not present is the ability to reason in nuanced ways about various moral situations.
Yeah, and again, you just made me think about some other situations where this comes up. I know a lot of times historically, this would pop up in like evangelical criticism of, the media, where it'd be like, oh, well, this movie has, X and Y naughty scenes in it. Therefore, no one should see it. Whereas maybe a more nuanced approach would be, okay, well, there's certainly some people shouldn't see it. If you're the sort of person who's susceptible to this, it would cause you to fall into these sorts of sins. Yeah, you shouldn't. But if somebody is able to still watch it with a more critical eye and not go, you need to know yourself and you need to know, is this the right decision for me? Maybe yes, maybe no. It depends on who you are. Again, that's the sort of thinking you can see on both sides, where you see it from the right, like I just said, and the left, where you'll see these attitudes. Well, I saw this pop up with Game of Thrones. Well, Game of Thrones, it didn't represent women very well, so therefore it's bad for everyone. It's easy to fall into that trap on either side. So I guess what I'd like to do now is apply some of these to the specifics of the Marvel universe. So, and we can do this either order you'd like, but could you think of some, whether specific movies, parts of movies, that you think do a good job of presenting maybe more nuanced moral thinking that would actually work for people in the real world?
Yeah, and I'll say what I think that Marvel has done really well over the course of these first three phases of their universe is raise these questions in very sophisticated ways without necessarily giving you a clear answer to them. They've not felt the need to answer every question they raise by the end of the movie, or as we're now in a position to say, by the end of the movie arc that lasted 22 movies. And one issue that I'll flag, and this is one that I flagged early on when I came to speak at Anselm a couple years ago before this year's Imagination Redeemed, we had an evening gathering where we talked about Marvel stuff. And that was just after Age of Ultron had come out. In fact, when I landed in Colorado Springs on the day that the DVD became available, and I had Brian go over and buy it as we were coming in from the airport so that I could show clips from it that night. And the scene that I'm thinking of is after the Avengers have been soundly defeated by Ultron, as Ultron stealing the vibranium, they retreat to Clint Barton's farm to regroup. And there's a scene where Tony Stark and Steve Rogers are chopping wood together and talking about the state of things in the midst of this demoralized moment. So Steve is upset at Tony for creating Ultron, for trying to create this suit of armor around the world, as Tony would call it, that would protect us from future threats without giving any thought to what the consequences might be, without asking the rest of the team about it. and all this sort of thing. And so his position is that when you try to win a war before it starts, innocent people die. And we know what he's thinking, right? He's thinking about World War II. That's still his proximate experience. But he's also got Hydra in the background because he's discovered that S.H.I.E.L.D. has been infiltrated and Hydra's been doing this very thing. Well, Tony's point is this. We know for a fact that there is an alien threat that is hostile to us that we don't have the technology to resist right now. So what's our response going to be when that gets here? What's our strategy, right? We have to develop next level threat response if we're going to be able to deal with this threat that comes. And so he puts Steve a very pointed question. What is your plan? Right? What are we going to do when the enemy shows up at our door? And Steve says, we'll fight them together. We don't separate and go do our own thing and you go invent something. We stand together as the Avengers and we fight them. And Tony says, what if that's not enough? And Steve says, well, then we'll die together too. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a bad plan. Right?
It's a really cool movie line, but...
It's a great movie line, but it's not much in the way of a plan. I like my plan to have a little bit more plan. But more important than whether Steve has any actual plan or not, know what he does have. He has the moral high ground. He's refusing to get involved in the devil's arithmetic, right? It's okay to allow 1,000 to die to save 1,000,000, or to allow 1,000,000 to die to save 1,000,000,000,000, right? He's not playing that game at all. He's taking the normal Hollywood line on this. We're going to do what's right, and we're going to fight virtuously, and we're not going to use the tactics of the enemy, and in doing so, we will prevail. Or at least if we don't prevail, we will not have turned into the enemy. We'll die as heroes. Right?
Yes.
And of course, this is the central Batman question, and so wonderfully reflected on in the Dark Knight movie, right? What does it look like for Batman to not be able to kill the Joker, and how do you remain the good guy through all of these twists and turns that go on? All right, so what the problem is, so Steve's got a really good point, morally speaking. However, Tony's got a really good point, practically speaking, and you got to wonder, is it worth it to hold the Steve position when you risk the lives of so many others? Well, Age of Ultron doesn't answer that question. That question remains unanswered. At the time, I thought that Civil War was going to be a battle of these two ideologies, that we're going to see Tony and Steve at odds over this very same question that was seeded in Age of Ultron, but I was wrong. It's really Endgame where it comes to a head. And this is the beautiful thing about this. Because in Endgame, when they finally get back together, when Tony is rescued and he's at the Avengers compound, he stands into Steve's face, even though he can barely stand, and he brings Steve back to this very conversation in Ultron. Yep. Suit of armor around the world. I told you we needed it. I warned you about it. You said we'd fight together. We weren't together. You're a liar. And I thought that was a very important moment for Marvel to put in there, and a very beautiful moment, because in the end, Marvel basically endorses Steve Rogers' position, right? That you don't become the enemy to defeat the enemy. You have to maintain virtuous and do things in ways that are consistent with your values. But they asked a really hard question, and they didn't have a good answer for that question, and they were willing to bring the question up again, to bring it back forward, and to show, look, this is still an outstanding position. Where are you going to come down on this? And then here's, to bring this example to a close, the beauty of it is they find a solution that enables them to satisfy everyone's concerns, right? Tony doesn't want to do the time heist because he's afraid that going messing with time, he's going to lose his daughter. He'll change the past, and his daughter will never have existed. He's not willing to risk what he has. And so the version of the plan they go with is not one in which they make the snap never happen. It's one in which they bring everybody who was destroyed by the snap back into the present, which is never the choice in movies, right? You always undo the thing that's done. And I knew coming into Endgame, I didn't know how they were going to do it, but I knew that somehow they were going to honor what happened at the end of Infinity War and not just erase it. This is the type of creative, imaginative middle ground that often we're not clever enough to come up with because we think we know the answer to the question, to the argument going on between Steve and Tony there. Steve is right and Tony's wrong. And so we do the Steve thing. But because Steve was shown to, we saw the end of his path and we saw that it was horrible defeat. Yeah. Tony's position was able to stay alive, and it was able to modify Steve's position to such an extent that they found a solution that would not otherwise have come upon. That's one example of what I think Marvel's done really well.
No, absolutely. And you also have to appreciate the patience to play out that story arc over that long haul and really present the movie viewers with the full consequences of Steve's position. Because, in the moment, in Age of Ultron, the audience is going to be very strongly on Steve's side because in that movie, Tony tries to put the armor around the world and it ends up creating this supervillain who kills a bunch of people and almost destroys the Earth. So you're like, wow, Tony, you idiot. Of course Steve's right. Let's do the right thing and not the stupid armor thing. But then they bring that several movies down the road to confront Steve's like, look, you have your little virtue and half the people in the universe have died. How do you feel about your virtue now? And I also appreciate the issue of the moral nuance is the solution. And anybody who's tried to, whether it's write a screenplay, write a story, whatever, I'm sure you can at least be sympathetic with the film, with the authors there, where it's like, okay, you need to have this moment of decision for the superhero. It needs to be very, very stark and show something about the character arc, blah, 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 all these sort of things you can read in characterization books. But going the third way is much more difficult. And it's something that they seem to do very well. But sort of along those lines, I remember something you brought up in your talk about sort of a microcosm of this that didn't go so well. And that was Captain America doing the same line with regards to Vision in Infinity War. Can you tell us what your issue was with Captain America's battle plans there?
Yeah, that's right. So as you'll recall, Vision is, of course, made by the joining of Jarvis and parts of Ultron and the Mind Stone. And Thanos needs the Mind Stone in order to complete the Infinity Gauntlet and do the snap, right?
Yeah.
And so here the Avengers are in possession of a stone, and if their options are, we can destroy the stone, which would also destroy Vision, and that'll stop Thanos. He won't be able to do the snap. The fewer number of stones is not enough. Or we can try to save Vision and separate the stone from Vision and then destroy the stone, and we can have our Vision and destroy our stone too. Now, here's the interesting thing. They think, okay, we don't have the technology to do this. How do we do it? Oh, we'll go to Wakanda. So they go to Wakanda. They present the plan to Shuri, who indicates that she is absolutely smart enough and has the resources to do this, but that she has to individually sever 2 trillion connections. And the question that is asked of her is, how long do you need? How much time do you need? And she says, as much time as you can give me. Okay, that's false. Right? I can give you 5 minutes. Can you get it done? Absolutely not. There's an actual amount of time that's required, and it's pretty clear we're not going to be able to create enough time for you to do this. In that moment, here's the thing. Earlier, Vision had offered, this was his plan to begin with, right?
Yeah.
I worked this out. Wanda can destroy the stone. I know it'll kill me, but this will stop. This is what we need to do. And Steve says, we don't do that.
Yeah.
We don't trade lives. And Vision says to Steve, you traded your life in World War II for the lives of all the people where the bomb was heading. I think he was on the New York plane. Mm-hmm. You put that plane into the ice, and you traded your life for all of those lives there. How is this any different? Before Steve can respond, Bruce Banner says, maybe it's because we don't have to choose. And that's when the plan comes in play. Well, let's separate the two. Well, that would have been a really important question to answer because that's at the heart of what's wrong with Steve's philosophy.
Yeah.
Right? Steve has never been able to answer that question. Had they gone ahead and destroyed Vision, they would have avoided the snap, and Vision ended up dying anyway, right? I mean, Vision isn't brought back. He's gone.
Yeah.
There was that moment of indecision and that desire to have it both ways. And the fact that when it becomes clear that they're not going to have enough time to actually execute the plan to have it both ways, the fact that within that moment nobody re-raises the question, wait a minute, she said 2 trillion connections, maybe we should change the plan here. Maybe we should revisit that kill Vision plan. That's what's wrong with the Steve Rogers school of philosophy right there, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I remember, I have a specific memory of this, seeing Infinity Wars in the theater where Vision offers to, sacrifice himself, and Captain America says, we don't barter in lives. And when he said that, I remember like, yeah, there you go. That's the cool thing to say. But when you take it a step...
America.
Yeah, exactly. When you take it a step further, it's like, okay, well, Vision has offered to do this, so in a sense it's his choice. This plan looks impossible because I'm no science expert, but 2 trillion, I feel like you're going to need more than like the 15 minutes of battle you have. And also,
Yeah.
there are going to be people dying in that battle right outside. Why are you saying Vision's life is more valuable than theirs? So it's all these steps that you sort of bypass because we're keeping our "we don't barter in lives" line.
That's right. I mean, it's in a sense, it's you don't feel as if Steve is responsible for the Wakandans who die in that battle against Thanos' army because he's not choosing their death, right? He doesn't send them to die, he sends them to fight, and they happen to die fighting. And yet, he didn't have to go out there.
Yeah.
Right? Let Vision sacrifice himself, right? Allow him to fall on that grenade. This is why I really loved these movies.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many things come back again. Remember in the very first Captain America movie, before he is even changed into the super soldier, the thing that convinces Tommy Lee Jones that he is a good candidate for the program is he takes a grenade and throws it on the ground in training, and everyone jumps back, and only Steve dives in and wraps himself around that thing, this scrawny little boy, to try to protect everybody else, right? Jumping on the grenade is what Steve Rogers does. And then he says to Tony in the first Avengers movie, I don't see you as that guy. I don't see you as the guy to lay down on the grenade, right? So this theme is already going through, and all he has to do is let somebody else do what he always does whenever he's presented with that choice. And yet he can't do it. Because to him, it feels like he's giving away a life rather than he is offering his own, if it's not his own life that he's doing it with.
Yeah, you see that sort of different standard he has for himself with others, where he will unquestionably sacrifice himself for his friends. That's part of what makes him a hero, but he won't allow his friends to willingly sacrifice himself for him or for others. Sort of, I don't know, contradiction in his character, or I don't know, part of its character. But yeah, it's all these really thorny, complicated questions. One of the credits of the series. So, we only have a few minutes left, so I wonder if you could just... I'm wondering here, because these movies started coming out in 2009. Now, here it is, 2019, 10 years later. We've had all this time with these movies, with these characters, 22 films. Let's project this like 10, 20 years in the future. How do you think we will view the legacy of these movies? Will these be the sort of movies that, like, we share with our kids and grandkids? What will you think their lasting, like, moral statement will be about our society?
Yeah, that's a very interesting and difficult question, right? Because we can never know there's so much historical accident that will play into whether these things last or not. But I'm inclined to say that they will. Whatever happens next with Marvel Studios, I'm very excited to see Spider-Man in a week. And I'm very excited to hear, presumably at D23 in a little bit here, what their plans are going forward. But let's say that they start falling off. The quality falls down, people get tired of them, for whatever reason, it's a downhill slope, and then the purists decide to consider the first 22 movies the proper thing, and nothing after that. Really Whatever happens, I think that it's impossible not to look at this 22-movie saga as an incredible achievement of our culture. Mm-hmm. It's an incredible achievement in storytelling, in myth-making, and it has really been a rallying point for a generation in the broad sense, right? Not for the kids these days, not for just you and I who grew up longing for movies like these to be made, but really across varieties of generations that most of folks alive today, really around the world, a great deal of people have rallied around these movies and have found themselves in them and found those stories to be powerful. I think that's enough to say that they will have an important legacy going forward. They will be viewed. Now, what I do wonder, the size of the thing is an issue, right?
Yeah.
I'm excited to show these movies to my kids, but that's 22 movies. That's an awful lot to get them caught up on, right? I mean, we used to think it was a big deal to try to get somebody caught up on Star Wars.
Yep.
So there is a question as to, is the size going to be an argument against their having a really deep relevance 40, 50 years from now, when this first generation of folks who were watching them as they came out have largely passed on. But Black Panther has generated really an enormous amount of scholarly attention.
Absolutely.
There was a whole panel devoted to it at the American Academy of Religion conference last fall, and I know there have been panels and the whole conferences organized around it. There are books about it already. I've got thoughts about it that I've not seen anyone write down yet. I don't know if I'll get about that or not. but it was like the kind of movie that was patient of that kind of critical attention.
Yeah.
I think Endgame's the same way, and I think there's a lot that can be done with looking at the ways in which, now that we see start to finish, how they tied everything together throughout the entire. There's a lot more to be said and to be researched about the various ways in which they tied this whole thing together. So I think that in addition to the cultural life that it will have, and Disney merchandising will certainly keep that alive for as long as possible, there's also a scholarly life that these things will have, an intellectual life in the minds of the thinkers in our society. And I expect they'll also last in that arena for quite some time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like, as you were talking, I was just thinking, oh, there are all these movies I wish we could have touched upon. You know, like you said, Black Panther has some really interesting, really complicated moral issues that it wrestles with. Same thing with like Captain America: Winter Soldier. Thor movies to some extent. Like, there's an interesting character arc that Hulk has, even though he doesn't have a featured movie after the first one. There's so many different levels to explore. And I agree with you about trying to figure out how to show it to my kids, because my oldest is 3.5, so it's not there yet. But when he does, like, what? We show him one movie a week and it takes half a year? I don't know what to do with that. But
right, that's right.
But yeah, Junius, thank you so much for doing this. I thought this was really interesting. And for you folks out there, if you want to hear Junius's whole talk at the Anselm Conference, that should be available on the Redeemed Imagination podcast feed, so check that out. So Junius, thank you so much.
Thank you, this is fun.
Yeah, and now, as always, we'll take things home with an Anselm of Canterbury quotation. And since our guest today was a theologian and a philosopher, let's do his most famous philosophical statement. God is that, the greater than which cannot be conceived. See you next time, everybody. Thank you so much.